A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
We're here today with Dr. Rob Cover. Rob Cover is a professor of digital communication at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. Rob's researches broadly on the health and belonging aspects of screen and digital media and technology, often from cultural and ethical perspectives, which is why we're here. He's led several major research council projects on minority representations in film, television, and digital media, and works also in the suicide prevention space, developing frameworks for approaching suicide prevention from arts, humanities, and social sciences perspective. He's interested in all aspects of our contemporary digital experiences and their implications for identity, belonging, behavior, health, and well-being, from digital health tracking devices to gaming platform. It's quite a range, and it's a pretty fantastic and amazing range. He's the author of 7 books and about 100 scholarly articles. His recent books include Digital Identities, Creating and Communicating the Online Self, 2016, Emergent Identities, New Sexualities, Gender and Relationships in the Digital Era, 2019, Flirting in the Era of Me Too, Negotiating Intimacy with Alison Bartlett and Kyra Clark, 2019, and Fake News in Digital Cultures with Jake Thompson and Ashley which is coming up this year. So this man is prolific, and he's here today to talk about the ethics of video games. Specifically, we're going to talk about the body, right? And the body is our bodies is definitely something that when we normally talk about video games is not a topic that comes up very often. Dr. Cover or Rob, which way would you like to be known in our conversation, Rob?
Rob, please.
Rob,
please.
All right. Rob, why don't you start it off by telling us why is it that you think the body is a neglected topic when it comes to talking about ethics in video games?
Look, thanks, Shlomo, and thanks, Andy, for inviting me on. This is, this is a great topic to think about and to talk about. Bodies are neglected in one angle of talking about gaming all the time. And this is a really old, what we kind of call a master signifier of the mind versus the body, or the soul versus the meat of the body, or the spirit of the self and the corporeal self. This old master signifier that is technically centuries old, but it really came into play in early internet days in the early 90s. When people were on chat rooms, and there was this entire cyberpunk discourse of letting go of the meat of the body that one kind of jacked into the internet, which really meant dial-up, and communicated and could be something other than what the body dictated, and then jacked out and came back to some kind of real life. And so it set up this real body versus virtual online space idea. And it's creepy now when we actually think about it, the idea of people going on and pretending to be something other than they are in a chat room. And it's dictated by the technology, of course, pre-broadband, where we couldn't really broadcast the face, or very much else about the self, where even, sending an image was going to take a while to download, so one didn't. And it influenced a whole set of scholarship and a whole set of public cultural thinking on how all digital technologies work, that somehow the body was irrelevant in this. And you combine that with this sort of William Gibson cyberpunk element as well, that the body is the meat that will be left behind, and that somehow we will be uploading our consciousness into an online setting, which of course is impossible and frankly ridiculous when we actually think about it. Consciousness is something that resides in the body. The body, there is no self without a body. There is no possibility of a disembodied self. But I think it's been problematic because it's governed a whole set of ways of thinking that suggested that anything that was digital was somehow not only disembodied and therefore good, but from a different angle, it was disembodied and therefore bad. And it was a site of being unethical. It was a site that would allow bodies to become unfit, or for people to behave in ways that were not governed by their identities, and so on. And one of the things that I've been trying to do is bring the body back into the picture as the absolute forefront, so that we stop thinking about mind versus body, or soul versus body, but see the body as being absolutely at the center of all gaming activity and all other kinds of digital communication.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because I'm thinking way back to I'm thinking back to the 80s, where I am with my modem, and I first go on BBSs and first get online. And that was the whole promise, that you can leave all of reality behind, right? And you can get into a new reality, and you can be anything you want. Even before we get into, right, this idea of uploading yourself, with this goal of uploading yourself, it was supposed to be liberating, right? This whole idea that your trappings, right, whether it's your mortal trappings, if you're like Ray Kurzweil and want to achieve a singularity moment and upload yourself, or if it was just like, here I am, there's so many things I can't do with this particular body, right? Or maybe I'm looked down on because I have this particular body, right? Online, or let's say in the game that I'm playing, right? I could be anyone, I could be anything. I'm liberated in this way. So what's wrong with seeing it this way, right? That our bodilessness is just liberating?
Really, because it's not liberating. That we do have to come back to the body, and also the body is present. And this is one of the things that I really sort of like about digital technology, when we try to look at it from that embodied angle, that we're surrounded by devices that are devices for our bodies, not devices to leave our bodies. So at the moment, we have screens and microphones and so on. Downstairs there are a couple of game devices. These are all things that are really not just corporeal, but things that we assemble ourselves into and engage with, in sort of ever more creative ways. So I've got this way of trying to think about it as a scene. That if we think about the space, if we want to think about, say, the internet or gaming spaces, as a space, which is always a bit weird too, that we are constantly pushing ourselves toward that scene. We're trying to get closer and closer to it, but we're never actually crossing into it. We're never leaving and departing our body at all. So the body is always there to start with. But is it liberating to try to be something other? It's informative. So I could play as a and give the impression to others that I might be a 13-year-old girl on a gaming platform. Mm-hmm. But there are all sorts of problems around that as well, and those are the problems around the violence that we might actually do to another 13-year-old girl who befriends me, thinking that I'm Rebecca. Right. And I'm her age, and in fact I'm not. And so the power imbalance that's already there in that relationship is problematized by not having actually been a little bit more honest about the body that I'm inhabiting. So it's not to say that it's not useful for me to try to think about, well, what might it be like to be a 13-year-old girl, and what might a 13-year-old girl experience, and what kinds of reactions might I actually get? And so that was the that very sort of liberal humanist perspective that came with this is so great when we go and do this online. But I think that the downside is that we may actually unwittingly be doing a violence to others just in order to improve ourselves. There might be better, more ethical ways for me to imagine what it's like to be a 13-year-old girl without necessarily having to give off the pretense of being one.
Right, and it's like if we're playing a role-playing game around a table, I could play a 13-year-old girl, and everybody knows that I'm not really a 13-year-old girl. But if I'm online, nobody necessarily knows that.
Yep, and I think the unfairness in the game environment as well, that that there is an added advantage that is changing the gameplay. Now that might be great for that 13-year-old girl who might be challenged by the opportunity to play against an adult. But at the same time, it's like we're not. I don't really think we've got a way of thinking through. Well, what actual damage might that be to someone who is going to be constantly losing, and then discover that is because she's been playing against someone that purported to be something quite different.
Right.
What does that do for the engagement with gaming? What does that do for the pleasure factor in it as well?
Right. We could be taking something away from her that she could enjoy her entire life. Right. And that seems like a real major harm.
So let me go back a little, right? Because we use words like violence and ethics, and we had this particular case. And let's go back to this case in a bit. I'm curious if you could, more broadly, what do you think is the relationship here, right, between the body and ethics? What sort of issue does thinking about the body raise when we talk about video games?
All right, look, thinking about the body it opens up new and interesting ways to think about ethics. There are two angles with this. One is the body is something that we all share. So there are no disembodied human beings. So we share that as part of our experience of humanity. And the second angle of that is that our bodies are vulnerable. From the very beginning of life, and this is work that I borrow a little from Judith Butler. From the very beginning of life, we are vulnerable and we are given over to being social beings. We don't survive unless we're cared for, from the moment of birth. So not being lizards that hatch and, most of us anyway, not being lizards that hatch and, crawl out and go and eat straight away. So we share that before we even have identities. So we're part of a social fabric. Simply because we are embodied, not because of any other reason, and because those bodies are vulnerable. So that, from the start, obliges an ethics because it pre-exists our sense of identity, our sense of selfhood, that comes in as we grow up. It obliges us to engage non-violently with that society, which means all the other bodies that are actually in it. All the other bodies that are also to come. So it's a slight trick of ethics to think what is the obligation that is there. And it's an obligation of being required to recognize ourselves as being dependent, as being, the terminology is constituted in, built literally upon that social setting, that we do not survive without society. We do not, and as we know, even as adults, we are not going to survive without society, isolated and alone. So being given over to that society from the beginning obliges us to not do violence to it, to others in it, and to the society that is to come, or the future that is to come. So it sets the scene for all sorts of ways of behaving, but not necessarily setting up rules for us to behave. So it's ways of conceiving how we can think through our place, our very being in society, without saying, well, here is a rule for you. You must not do this. You must never, take up arms. You must, sort of always speak in a peaceful, hippie-like tone. You must, and so on. That those aren't really quite what an ethics can do. What it really does is force us to think about the quandary of how we make decisions. So how we might make decisions for the future, say in relation to the climate of the earth. Are our decisions, my decision to throw that piece of plastic, into the bin, is that a decision that's going to, do violence to the future of humanity? Probably. The requirement, the ethics here is to think through that rather than to say, that this is always bad. If I've got to throw that in the bin because I want to go and rescue someone who is about to, fall off the cliff, then, that is not. But so it's really a way of governing how we think about the decisions that we made, rather than actually giving us a set of rules, regulations, and regimes.
So we got at the heart of this, right? This recognition that we're all vulnerable, right? And this kind of guide that, at the heart of our dealing with other people is recognizing their own vulnerability as well. And we could talk about this obviously in terms of the body, in real life, right? But now we're in games, so.
Well,
How do we get this right? And I guess maybe a way into this, and I'm trying to get kind of into it, and then we can kind of broaden out. But in what way are people vulnerable in games? And so, if our obligations here are our way of kind of engaging with other players and other people in the games in the gaming world, even if we're not directly playing with them, what do we need to consider in terms of the vulnerability of the other people involved?
So how are people vulnerable in games? I mean, I think that the best starting point is how they are not. And, for me, that is someone's avatar is not vulnerable. It's not necessarily unethical for me to shoot down somebody else in the game. In the same way, I suppose, as during the Olympics, it wouldn't be unethical to beat somebody, even though they're going to feel sad at only coming, fourth in the Olympics. The worst thing that can happen to some people, but that's within the context of the gameplay itself. That's not necessarily the unethical part. So it's really around that meta level that I'm quite interested. How do we treat each other in the context of gaming? So I'm thinking of the kinds of examples in which we've seen, inherent racism, inherent chauvinism and sexism in some game cultures. And I don't want to say that this is, universal in any way, because it's not. Sure. It's actually, among a relatively small group of people, but a small group of people who are effectively ruining the game for others. So where the game space becomes, a negative space to actually be in, a space of, feeling shame for being different. So I'm thinking about the violence of marginalization, the violence of exclusion, the violence of certain kinds of bullying, of certain kinds of online hostility that's at play in those spaces. The violence to the game itself, and this is the one that I'm actually very much interested in when I think about digital hostility. The way people will, in some examples, will actually ruin the space for others. So we see the kind of the graffitiing of online forums like Reddit, and the disruption of that space, or the disruption of particular practices, cultural practices that have emerged around that. And I think we're also seeing that in game spaces where someone goes in with the intent to wreck it for everybody and take pleasure in that. Now that to me would be an unethical act, because it's doing violence, to the game as a space. It's doing violence to the people who are there, and it may actually be wounding linguistically people, through certain kinds of name calling or certain kinds of racism or sexism, and that all of these kinds of violences can be quite serious. So violence is really problematic, I think, because it's such a flexible term, and the term itself gets used in all sorts of awkward ways. So there are attempts to try, and this often happens in legislation, attempts to try to say violence is only physical, that there is no kind of verbal violence. Like we do have, very often defamation laws, depending on our jurisdiction, which actually recognizes that certain kinds of ways of speaking can do a violence to another person. But often that tries to test it to say, but how much monetary value have they actually lost, rather than how much have they felt hurt or felt offense or or had their pleasure ruined.
I'm glad you brought that up, because it was one of the things that we were discussing before you popped on, was like this idea, like most people think of violence as something physical, but then if you're in activist spaces, then you start hearing about things like economic violence, and you hear about, microaggressions and these sorts of things, and the violence of these sorts of things. And that's sort of a different way of thinking about violence.
Absolutely. And of course, one of the things, just like ethics, we don't necessarily want to pin down, a strict definition of what violence will actually be, because the term is used. We don't want it to grow too large. But we often see it used by, let's say, states and governments in regards to legitimate protest, and it'll be talked of, the violent protest, the violence of a protest, even though that protest is actually probably ethical, because it's attempting to reduce other kinds of violence or attempting to address or redress other kinds of violence.
Right.
So you don't necessarily want to, to have a strict definition of it, but at the same time, we do have to recognise that, yes, it's not necessarily going to be, the physical blow. And that in some cases, the physical blow is not necessarily going to be a violent act either. The physical blow to restrain someone who is hurting somebody else, the physical blow in self-defense and so on is, sort of ethical.
Right.
Or the physical blow in the game that involves physical blows. Right. I mean, that's, that itself is going to have a time and a place, though it's interesting because we talk about that as, a time and place for a violence where we take out the negative connotations of violence. It's interesting because, we can definitely talk about, to me as a philosopher, the thing I latch on is to the potential harm done. Right. And I love this idea of thinking about the vulnerability of the people that we engage in. Right. And I think of it not just in terms of the trolls that we can talk about and the bullies, but also the game designers. Right. As game designers are thinking about the vulnerabilities of the populations that they might engage with. Right. Whether those are minorities dealing with representation or disabled people of various kinds, or kids, obviously. Right. And obviously we can have psychological harm. But at the same time, there's also the harm that can come to people from being offended. And I've always had a problem with, the harm that you get from being offended. This is, to me, has always been personally like a difficult thing to deal with. On the one hand, I feel like, of course, you got to care about people being offended. They're offended and they're harmed. But I always think, but wait a minute, do they, am I responsible for them being offended? Right. And one nice thing about this ethics of vulnerability is it doesn't maybe think in terms of obligations in this sense, right? So traditional moral philosophy would kind of think, am I obligated to make sure that no one's offended? Well, no, not really. But if instead I'm going on this kind of direction where I want to think about how people are vulnerable, right? I can be hurt. If I put myself in the position of other people who could also be hurt, maybe I want to proceed with doing that before I decide what exactly I'm going to do. Is that the idea, Rob?
Yes, no, very, very true. I agree as well on the question of offence and the question of insult as well, that it is questionable. And there, again, is no strict way in which we can say, we must never offend, we must never insult. And we're not necessarily even responsible alone for the offence or the insult. In giving an insult, we're always borrowing from a wider context anyway. We didn't make up the term, we didn't make up the insult. There is a wider social obligation around this, around minimising offence and minimising insult. But if we try to make it individual, we're effectively barking up the wrong tree, really. And this is where this, I hate to invoke the language of woke, given the way it's being discussed in the public sphere at the moment, as if it's a two-sided debate that, offence is always wrong, or, it's fine to insult as widely as possible. And it's obviously a lot more complex than that.
Right.
But we do need to think then, and this is where, I like coming back to ethics around how do we engage with each other as a social body without making people vulnerable, which does not necessarily preclude offending people. I'm offended by all sorts of things. I'm offended to have to get up in the mornings, really, and I find I'm insulted by it. But, there's actually probably greater harm to myself if I don't. So, I think there are ways of being that, acknowledge that, offence is actually going to occur, but we do have to find ways to minimize that. It's a task for the wider social body. We need people to be more resilient around what is offensive and what is not. And I don't think that that's going to come by by taking that anti-woke perspective, which says you should be more resilient. Let the insult ride. It's like rather we should really be recognizing that insults do damage to people, and they are violent. But as a social body, we need to start to develop ways we can't conceive of yet of better communicating that minimizes that insult or minimizes the harm that comes from an insult.
Can we talk about some specific examples of where, right, thinking about the body in games now and thinking about this idea of vulnerability can really come into play?
Like a specific example, I suppose, of gaming and in which bodies are made vulnerable. It's really, the fact that so much of this happens at a distance is not really, sort of where we see the body made vulnerable, but the body that is actually, again, hurt by the offense or hurt by the insult, which is a bodily reaction. When we feel shame, we blush. That we know, and there's work on this is only at its very beginning, but we know that there can be cerebral damage from being persistently insulted or persistently offended, in ways that are experienced quite viscerally. So people will make themselves sick by being in particular spaces or become sick from it. So there is a level of vulnerability there, but really this does happen much more at the conceptual level. So where I'm really interested is in what happens then when we start bringing bodies together in gaming. What happens when we start moving away from the stereotype of gamers as being alone, isolated, in mum and dad's basement, aged 48, and are on the verge of, shooting up a workplace or a shopping mall and so on. That stereotype is probably the most dangerous thing that's actually happened for thinking about the ethics of gaming, because it seems to come back and seems to hover as this spectre, always there when key stakeholders talk about gaming, and we know that that's not actually how gaming is experienced at all.
Right.
So experience of it,
if it was ever true that was the gamer, it's certainly not true anymore. Like everybody plays games now. Literally everybody. Grandmother's playing games. The kids are playing games. Mom and pop are playing games. Everybody's playing games now.
Though it's interesting how we, it is easier. So if we're talking about embodying the gamer, right, that this is kind of the image of, if we're going to connect to the quote unquote gamer as another person, right, if we're a non-gamer, right, it's interesting that this is the image that was latched onto. And this is the embodied image, right, of people who in the game world, right, you would not have any kind of bodily, knowledge of. And yet this is the image that we came up of their bodies.
Right. But is that, like when I say I'm a gamer, is it different than just saying I like to play games?
I actually like the term gamer, but it's like bikey versus, I ride a motorbike, or, I'm a trekker as opposed to, I just watch masses and masses of Star Trek. Mm-hmm. It's like the way that one label then becomes stereotyped, where a stereotype always takes an identity label and sticks a whole bunch of attributes to it. So, when someone tells me they're a gamer, the assumption is, obviously not us where we know better, but, if someone tells, for example, my mother that they're a gamer, and her perception is going to be, yes, this is a very lazy person, who moves from the bed to the desk in the basement and plays games all day and then goes back to bed again, doesn't eat well and so on. Now, that doesn't really matter, because I don't really think that my mother's view is necessarily going to be, significant. I think of examples, though, where someone might go, I'll go to my GP and, for medical advice, and, I might have, let's say, high blood glucose, and I'll confess to being a gamer. And the response I get is through that stereotype. Oh, well, you need to do more exercise. You need to, change your eating habits and so on.
Right.
Thank
You might also be a marathon runner, but that's not what you said. You said, I'm a gamer.
I'm a gamer because that's how I might identify in that space. And then what that means then is that the test for pancreatic damage has not actually been done to determine what is necessarily wrong. Now that would obviously be a really bad GP who's not really seeing the whole person in front of them.
Right.
But we know that at this kind of absurd level of the example that the stereotype can do a lot of damage when we are misinterpreted as being something that we're actually not. Most gamers I know are sort of exceedingly fit and active and have active lives and jobs and massive social lives and don't live in a basement and so on. As I'm often thinking, it was never true, that stereotype anyway. Playing games in the late 80s and early 90s as a kid was it was an exceedingly social event. It may not involve my family, but people came around, bodies came together around a Commodore 64 or whatever we were using, in ways that were involved a lot of social engagement, in ways that we learned how to hopefully be more ethical with each other. That might be around sharing the game time as well, making sure that I was the one probably who was left behind, not given as much game time as others, but there was an engagement, that learning and the decisions that are actually made around that, and the social life of that particular game and that gameplay and that group of people.
Rob, I'm thinking about and Andy and I have talked about this before, right? The difference between the way Westerners and let's say people in China or South Korea play, right? Where as Westerners, we often play, let's say, on our own, though connected to people through a headset, right? While in Asia, it's often a social activity where you go with your friends, right, to the PC Bang or to the internet cafe. Is there a difference at how they perceive the body in relation to gaming? Do you know anything about that?
I do know that there are different ways of conceiving how bodies come together in terms of digital technologies related to various cultural practices, and that sometimes depends on when the technology was introduced as well. Throughout a lot of the West, and I think particularly North America, Australia, the UK, there were we were experimenting a lot with how to introduce technologies into our lives that came into other spaces later. And some of the models, depended on our housing, the way our cities are designed, the rural settings we lived in, and so on. And they were brought in ways that changed those spaces, but also governed how those technologies were brought into our lives. In other settings, and I've got friends and colleagues in parts of South India have very different ways of conceiving of gaming. And this is, about how rooming happens, how housing happens, how families work together, in ways that relate to technologies. I think in particular in North America, we introduced, say, the second TV set a lot sooner than occurred in other cities. So you get this kind of divide of the family, the children's space and the adult space.
Right.
And that's happening in a little bit ahead of the personal computer as well,
right?
Which starts as the family machine, and then of course sort of individualizes into these other spaces. But you've got this economic elements then to it as well. In what spaces are these affordable and not, and how does that govern particular kinds of gameplay? At the same time, you've got the introduction of mobile gaming as well, which becomes more popular in some settings, and it's played. And I know again when I'm in China, it's I see a lot of people playing games on mobile devices, but together. And I don't know whether they're playing the same game or not, but there's a cluster in a public space rather than the private space of the bedroom.
Yeah, I have a mobile game that I play every day that I've invited my friends into my clan, on this game, and there is a social element to it. Even when we do get together physically, we talk about it. Let me ask you about esports. So esports seems like an opportunity for us to try to like drive home the idea that games happen, games include our physical bodies, because these esports athletes, and they are athletes, that we're finding that they need, they can't be lethargic, and they can't be that typical, that archetypal gamer in order to be competitive. They need to, actually, be fit. And so that seems like a really good opportunity then to say, look, clearly this doesn't just happen in your brain. This happens throughout this includes your brain and your body working together.
Yeah, I think so. I remember seeing, it must be, very early 2000s, when the dance mat came out as a device for gaming. I mean, of course, we all thought that was really naff and it didn't really work, to start with. But there was this moment at which, I think people were becoming very, very aware, beginning there and then into, say Wii Fit and so on, and, and the gaming applications around that this was very much, a sort of a bodily fit, sort of engaged way of being there. But I suppose for me, where I get really interested in the question of the body as well is, and I don't really know if there's a lot of research on this, but in how people who are playing less active kinds of games perceive their body as well, and perceive the bodily reactions, the sweat, the being on edge, the adrenaline rush, which can even be something as as simple as what did I do the other night? It was an utterly banal game. It was just Microsoft Titans, Chess Titans, and really this was just a moment in which I should have been writing but was taking a break. So this is meant to be some downtime, absent-mindedly playing, but getting excited, and then then losing. My king is taken, and realizing, oh my God, I've cried out. It's 3 a.m, and I've cried out. This thing, and realized that there's this whole bodily thing. I'm sweating and anxious. Over a simple game of chess that's
right.
At a moderate level. And that's just chess. It's like there is such a physical element to it. There are all these processes that are actually happening. So it really, when I think of gaming, I think of it on that continuum from those to to the esports games, which you've got a lot of activity and a lot of preparedness for it, and a lot of fitness around it as well. That as I always say, the body is always there in the game, in the act of playing a game.
It's certainly true that I have taught in my class that games take place in our minds, and I'm going to stop doing that. To say that these games take place in our bodies, which include our minds, right?
Depending on your mind-body theory, of course. I have to step in as the philosopher here. I want to go back to this idea of vulnerability and the body, right? And I'm thinking here about the relationship. What does this tell us in terms of the effort that's been put recently into giving people the options, greater options, in customizing their in-game bodies, right? Their virtual bodies. How do you think that kind of plays into it? This kind of, ethics of vulnerability. This is coming from the game design companies, but of course they're responding also to, both public demand and player demand.
Look, it's funny. I think a lot about avatars, and I've really got two quite conflicting views on it. There was a whole lot of research done about 10 or 15 years ago around how people were choosing their avatars or their in-game bodies, and finding that it didn't necessarily align well with how people identified. So, I think this is this great case in which we found that a lot of teenage boys were choosing I don't know, it was a Princess Peach or something because of the way the character played in game, and that alignment of the self with how one's represented on screen was not really a key factor. But that's not necessarily going to be for everyone, and so I'm really interested in how opportunities are changing for people to actually line up gaming characters. And this is really, it becomes a matter of representation. Do we have enough people of color represented in games in a way that allows sort of a young person to say, not just I am represented and I can see myself on that screen, so I don't feel excluded to begin with, but also that that I can play as that particular person. It opens up then a greater range for for other people to actually be able to see as well. But that range is going to have to keep on increasing. So we're starting to see examples of a push to make sure that can we have non-binary people represented? How can we ensure a very vast range of genders and races to be available there, as on-screen bodies. And so this feeds into some of my desire, my ethical desire to see people as representing themselves in a slightly more honest way in online spaces. And we know that that's where people become less violent and less harmful towards others, when there is honesty. So we know that from social media, that when people anonymize themselves, we see greater digital hostility, particularly in, say, online forums. I think that that's actually playing out in gaming culture as well, that when people can actually be more anonymous or feel that they're not necessarily going to be traced, then the ethical obligation falls to the side. But when it's me and my face, and literally my face, and since we're getting so close to being able to do that with technologies now, with deepfake technology, to be able to incorporate exactly me into a game space, or at least video space, but I don't think we're very far off that. Now that might actually become one of the logical ways in which we become more ethical, by representing ourselves. But it's also going to have all sorts of problems around that as well. Problems of identification, problems of risk, being, especially younger people, and so on. And we don't have any kind of roadmap for trying to work out how that might actually play out.
It's interesting that you're thinking about that already, because I was involved with a project a couple of years ago about, there was going to be basically a virtual shopping center where people would their avatars, they could match their physical, their actual measurements, so that they could go clothes shopping, buy things, see how it looks on their avatar, and then have that shipped to them. So we might see some of that. That's where I would expect to see some of that stuff start to show up. But yeah, we make avatars for ourselves in all kinds of ways, like Animal Crossing. I've got a little Animal Crossing me. I've got a me on my Wii, the little character. And sometimes I keep hoping that when we come back after this COVID thing, that we'll all be basically dressed like our Animal Crossing characters.
I was actually thinking about player role identification, right? And how important it is for me, at least, usually, right? I usually really enjoy identifying with my characters. And reading an article from, I don't know, maybe it was like 7 years ago, where a woman was essentially talking about how that experience has just been something that she's never really thought of. She didn't really think that's what gaming was about. That for her, gaming was essentially about the fantasy of playing someone else, because role identification just really wasn't available to her. And so it's not like she missed it. She just saw herself as having a different experience. But from my perspective, like, oh man, did she miss out on something really, really important, or at least the option to do that? And it's really interesting, this idea of if our avatars really represented us. So we have much more role identification. Whether that really is true, that we would, be more honest, more ethical. Though it's, if the only reason is because we're scared of real repercussions. I mean, mind you, that still is a reason, right? I mean, that's still, there's, it's not a bad thing we have social repercussions for being jerks, for being bad to people. I mean, that's a good thing. But it's interesting if just beyond those social repercussions, if we would just feel, if we feel our vulnerability more when we are identified. I mean, God, and I have to say, I would feel vulnerable in a game if it was my real face. And then I wonder if I would then feel that others are equally vulnerable in this way. Is this a good idea, Rob? Do you think we should push for everybody to be with their faces or with their real bodies in game?
I think it's a really difficult one because I think it can also reduce the pleasure factor as well.
Definitely.
If we have to be upfront. I mean, I think about playing. I used to play a lot of civilization-based games, and I'd just be playing alone. But my in-game character in that space was, a dreadful totalitarian fascist dictator. What I would do to build a city or to build an empire, which would never align with my politics. Now, I would hate to be doing that in an online space with my name on it, and then be providing evidence, for some, terrible person who's going to try to harm, say, my reputation by saying, well, Rob Cover's, this awful fascist dictator. Look at how he plays these games, because it's simply just play, and we recognise that while play is it's invested in culture as well. There are certain lines that demarcate it, and so it's possible for me to go and do that. It's of course possible also to explore. It's like, well, what does it mean? How does it make me feel to be this fascist dictator? So that's part of the ethics of sort of engaging also.
Then
so you have that part at play, but would I play differently if I was up front in an online setting with my name and photograph?
If I could interject a little bit, I think you might end up being an actor to a degree, right? Like an actor would take on a role, and of course everybody knows it's the actor, but sometimes sometimes people don't see the actor, like the role is so strong or the character is so strong. After that, the actor has a hard time getting work outside of that kind of character playing, or nobody can see them in anything else other than that. So you have this sort of dilemma, right? Of like, should I play, there's a movie where I could play Hitler, but should I, or will I be stuck playing Hitler for the rest of my life?
Or will those, it's interesting. My wife was an actor. And, I've talked to her before. Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, essentially was really worried about butchers. And, he was really worried about how butchers kill all the time. Right. And he assumed that, and I'm putting this in the game context, right? Because, of course, we do that in a game context, right? We kill all the time. And here you have these butchers who literally kill all the time. And he was essentially warning people about, the dangers of butchers because they were used to killing animals. So they were probably going to be more likely to kill people. And I talked to my wife about this in terms of acting. Right. If you did play someone, let's say you were doing a play and every night you were Hitler. Right.
Right.
Would that affect your long-term personality? Right. And you think of all the, does Liam Neeson go around killing like tons of people, or pick your favorite action hero? Right. And, it seems it's interesting how that effect when we do act. I see my wife walking behind me. When we do act, it still seems not to, be a part of our identity to that kind of degree. But of course, as, Andy and I have talked before, you think of a game like Manhunt 2043, right? This idea of like a virtual reality, super realistic, and you wonder how acting as yourself in that, and whether being yourself in that rather than the character that you're coming into the story with might have this kind of impact on you just because you're wearing your body, right?
Yeah. I don't know that I'd be able to play myself in a game.
Me neither. Not like that.
I don't know. I don't know that I would behave in the way that everybody thinks that I should behave.
Yeah, and I think that destroys the pleasure element as well, because it is in part about wanting to be something other as well, and wanting to explore that something other. I think acting, though, is the best analogy for it. The problem I think we have, though, is that a good actor recognizes that and even if they're a method actor, they recognize that that there is a distinction between the self and the part that's being played.
Right.
A good critical audience member recognizes that as well. But then, some soap opera stars, who've been, sort of really, really nasty characters there, do get spat on in the street.
Right.
As well. So, some people do have difficulty differentiating between, the character that they see and the actor that they see. And, it's we want to be really careful not to be demeaning to those people as well. But it does come down to a lack of critical faculties, a lack of the capacity to do critique, to see context, to see intertexts, to see what our everyday perspective will just say is to see reality, but to see things that as they are. So I often think of, say, how conspiracy theorists, mistake, the fantasy of a conspiracy for, the reality that, our politicians are usually just bumbling about and, couldn't manage a conspiracy, let alone the actual things that they said they're going to do. But it's the ability for critique to do that. And critique is ethical.
I want to go back to the acting thing, because it made me think of, okay, so actors are sometimes criticized for taking on the role of bodies that are supposed to be not available to them, right? So, right, typically that's racial. What do you think about that in games, right? Is there, are there responsibilities that come in this context in games in terms of the bodies we choose? Are some bodies... and of course, we have this whole fantasy element, right? Is there a limit of how we do that? Doesn't matter if we're in a single-player game or multiplayer game, or is it that we have a license in the gaming universe to kind of abandon our real body and allow ourselves a chance to try out anybody we want?
I think the capacity to try things out is something that would be lost if it were, only us, or if we always had to align our identity. I think, there's a lot at the moment around non-trans actors playing transgendered characters, and I understand the argument, but I have a bit of a concern about whether we lose something by saying we must always align. It's good to align because it does mean that trans actors then can actually get more work, and that the work that is most suited for them in many cases is not being taken away. But when David Duchovny played a trans character in Twin Peaks in, the very early 90s, he did something that was, he did a great justice to everyone, because he really showed that, this relatively masculine character actor was able to actually to do a trans character without it being a joke or without it being funny, and and it's played with great sympathy and great dignity. And I think that did something then for how trans people are actually perceived then. So it's like there's enormous benefit for others as well to see people doing things that are not necessarily in alignment with that identity as well. So in the context of a game, to be able to see that perhaps, so maybe we need more information to say it's like, look, this is who I am in the game, this is who I am in real life. Don't troll me to find this information, and don't dox me, but I will be upfront if everybody else will be upfront, and please understand that I'm making particular choices here because it's pleasurable, or because it's it's interesting to me to do so, or because I'm trying to make a point. That there are all sorts of diverse motivations for how we choose those in-game characters.
Right. And we have a responsibility, if we're going to play something that is not ourselves, to treat that character with respect, to treat the right? So that we're not basically just doing virtual blackface.
Right, right. And yeah, I was thinking of all the kind of it's interesting because part of this is in the hand of developers, of course, right? To what options are you going to have, and what if I want to play a stereotype, and I want to really amp that up to the stereotype in the most negative kind of ways, that I can do.
Right.
And notice,
people
right,
will do that.
Absolutely. And
People,
of course,
will.
people will do that because
Yeah.
people are wonderful and people are assholes, and and though it's interesting, of course, with the anonymity, right, aspect of it, people will do that more, right? But it is interesting, right, because with the example of, let's say, the trans actors or Latino actors, right, someone is losing out. Here, you have this fantasy world where no one's obviously losing out, but you still want to think about the vulnerability of the people you are encountering, right? As you take, and no one's going to care if you're taking on, like, you've mutated your dark elf body in some sort of way, right? Versus, you are essentially playing as like a really bad negative stereotype of a Latina.
Right.
Right.
You've got the context element, I suppose, really at play. I mean, I think a lot about how my partner and I will mimic dreadful racists by using the kinds of language, and we do this, at home. Usually in discussing
behind closed doors.
Yeah, behind closed doors. Because if anyone heard this out of the context or did not understand the context, we would sound like a horrible racist saying terrible, insulting things. We found that we've actually even sort of over years have curtailed that more to be concerned. Mm-hmm. Gosh, what if somebody did over here? It's even more serious. Now that's a good thing, because that to me is one of those ethical quandaries there. But the sort of like, well, how should we speak, and and how insulting might it be to actually even to parody a racist? But at the same time, I think that if context were better recognized and the people around us were more critical, then it would become a less harmful event and might be more of a training or more of a pedagogical event for other people as well, rather than being mistaken. So one of the things I sort of fear a lot, socially, is that we've become so quick to judge on so many things, and to judge, say, that person chose that particular avatar. Now, what does that mean? Okay, yes, now I've seen it. Good. Without actually asking, or without actually sort of critically unpacking what is actually happening. And I don't want to do that dreadful old nostalgia thing of like, things were so good before the internet, and we all just thought, we all asked questions and slowly, because that wasn't true at all. And that's just, false nostalgia for something that didn't really exist. But, I think that, that becomes where the, sort of the ethics actually plays out in how can we actually be less judgmental and more critical, and in the critique sense, by engagement, rather than simply slamming a particular behavior that I instantly judged as wrong.
Yeah.
You say that gaming teaches us about social justice in its play as a kind of corporal and bodily and a social activity. How does gaming do that? So let's end up on hopefully a positive note, right? As how does gaming teach us about social justice and the body?
Look, I think it becomes the place to play out things that actually matter. Look, I mean, I am, I'm often very interested in that line of play, that Heutzinger, where does, the play is always non-purposeful and, it has no utility, but exists. It's part of culture, but it's always separated from it. And I'm interested in how that line actually is a very grey one as well. I always like to avoid arguments about, games, have a utility. That reminds me of those sort of childhood remarks that I used to get, playing games that, by nervous parents or teachers, who want to accept but don't really. It's like, oh, it's very good for hand-eye coordination. It's like, well, yeah, probably, but I don't think that's at stake. So I don't like that sort of utility, and I don't like to say that games always are without a purpose either. Pleasure has its own purposes, but I do think that there is always a pedagogical element in everything that we actually do, and so that's why I tend to think that if if the attitude to gaming is right, if it's the one that sees the body, corporeality, the way we work together, thrown into social settings and thrown into a game space in which we're obliged to cohabit rather than to exclude or to say these people should not be here, or and so on. It's that opportunity to play those out and learn, and to constantly learn, in that interaction with others. And this is where, for me as well, it's about getting away from the stereotype of the game as being, something that is played exclusively alone, privately and silently. But the sociality of it is very much overemphasized, and I don't think it matters that we're not socializing in the same bodily space. We are bodies that are connecting and assembling together across vast distances in order to play out how does society work and how should society work, and that just like film and television, which also plays out those key questions, all the time. How should people behave? What are our ways of engaging with each other? And they do them to varying degrees, but it's still always that question. I think that's part of what humanity and human communication is about. How can we do better all the time? That's in a sense sort of why we communicate.
What does that mean? Well, I'm going to dig a little bit into the same question. What does that mean for people like me who are game designers? Is this like, should I just make sure that I'm always just thinking about the game assemblage, as you talk about, the game plus the players plus their minds plus their bodies, all of that is the game, or the game space, inside the circle, the magic circle we've talked about. Is that basically the way I should just think about things and then proceed onward, or is there more specific things I should be thinking about?
No, look, I think yes, but I think that most game designers I talk to already do think about those things, and this is where again the problem of stereotypes, the problem of the idea that a game designer is only thinking about the narrative of the game, or or how it's going to look and so on. But so we know for a fact that most game designers are thinking about not just will this be popular, will people enjoy playing it, but how will people play it, how will it further the engagement. What are the bodily limits to it? What kinds of game controllers will be needed, and so on.
Right.
That's all sort of really the picture
covered within the idea of the user experience. Right.
So I think that I think that most game designers and developers think in that ethical way, and I really hate seeing the industry being slammed for games that are perceived to be violent, or aggressive, and to say that these are just dreadful people training our children to do terrible things to each other, because we know again that even children get this, even kids can understand the difference between being unethical and playing a first-person shooter and really get it. But I don't know. But I think there are other things. It was about the question of what game developers could do around ethics. Here's an interesting one that I've been thinking about a lot, and this might just be me getting older and nostalgic for games I played in the past. But is there an ethical responsibility on the industry to preserve those games and to preserve the access to them as well? Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking of the Commodore 64 games that are really difficult to play because the emulators don't work well, or you spend so much time. But they were important spaces for engagement, for myself and my friends. Or early Microsoft games, just any of those games as they played out. So I can see them in a museum, perhaps, of game design, but and I might even be able to play it there. But is that nostalgia factor? Is that something that's important? Should we do more to make sure that these stay forever available?
Right. There's film, like UCLA here in Los Angeles has the big film archive, and they spend a lot of money to make sure that old films are preserved for future generations. Well, we haven't really got that for games, and I think that's a great idea.
Do we really not have a game archive? Is that really not a thing? I need my 1985 Summer Games and Summer Games 2 so I could do diving. Right, that was my favorite in 1985. I want that back, Commodore 128. Right. All right, Rob. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so
Thanks
much.
for having me on.
Is there? Can you tell our listeners? Is there anywhere that you want to be found on the interweb?
Google search, and there's bits and pieces of me around the place.
All right. Cool. Rob, we end our podcast. If you want to join us with GP, good podcast. Right? All right. Good podcast, guys.
Good podcast, GP.
All right.
GP.
Play nice, everyone.